People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. Verite Research recently did an analysis and found that Sri Lanka has the highest electricity cost in South Asia. Now, this was a few weeks ago. Since this reportage, there has been a 21.9% reduction in electricity tariffs announced. But prior to this, there have been multiple increases in 2022 as well as 2023. So let's get into the story. I'm so pleased to welcome back to the studio Rajakulendran, lead economist from Verite Research. Good evening and welcome, Raj.
Thank you for having me.
Raj, when we take electricity tariffs, since 2014, so from 2014 to 2022, there were no increases in electricity tariffs. But from 2022, there were some crazy increases in electricity costs, in electricity tariffs. And there were some controversial increases as well. And now, just recently, a few days ago, a 21.9% reduction was announced. So are we supposed to be pleased? What's going on? Take us through the whole story. What are we not seeing here?
So let us start with what Verite did in our analysis, where we said that Sri Lanka had the highest electricity cost in South Asia. In other words, you were paying 2.5 to 3 times higher in electricity prices in Sri Lanka as opposed to anywhere in South Asia. So this was a fairly straightforward analysis where we basically went into each of the countries in South Asia, looked at their tariff structures, calculated the electricity bill at varying electricity consumptions, and just did a simple comparative analysis. And when at the time of publishing this, the proposed reduction was around 3%. And after we said this, there were multiple increases in the reduction, and we finally settled at 21.9%. Even after this reduction, Sri Lanka is still paying on average 2 to 2.5 times higher than the South Asian average. So Sri Lankan electricity prices are still relatively high. But the question is, why is it so high? And you did mention the latest increase in October 2023, which was the controversial one. Verite did something called a fact check right after October 2023 increase, which was in November, where we tried to understand why was this increase necessary. And the minister too, in his statement in Parliament, mentioned that this increase was required because the generation cost was amounting to be 889 million for the year. So you needed this increase to settle off for that cost. But when you read the documents presented to PUCSL and CEB, you realize that this cost is based on the worst possible scenario mentioned. So because it depends on rainfall, it depends on the cost to CEB depends on various mechanisms. It depends on the rainfall, it depends on the electricity consumption, and 889 million was the worst possible cost that CEB projected. So there were around 10 scenarios, and 889 was the worst possible scenario. And the minister seems to be running based on the worst possible scenario to ascertain the increase. So what essentially should have happened is, even the PUCSL has highlighted this, where the tariff was quite high and there was no analysis on which scenario was more likely to happen, but rather the worst possible scenario took place. Which is why closing 2023, CEB made massive profits of 61 billion, which is significant considering CEB has been making losses throughout. And because of that, this reduction was almost imminent. You had to have this reduction, and an increase would have been completely unfair. But that's where we stand. So the reduction of 21.9 stems from previous increases, which were not too necessary because they lacked the analysis of any weather analysis or any forecasting. PUCSL too has as the regulatory body highlighted this issue, but tends to stem from the analysis that the CEB has done on its own. So the lack of analysis behind these policy makings, which I think I've mentioned before, happens in taxation, also is a recurring problem in tariff decisions as well.
For an increase in electricity tariffs, that must necessarily mean that there is a high electricity cost, yes. Correct? Okay, so for there to be a disproportionately high cost in electricity, if I were to ask you, who is pocketing the money, or is there a mafia? Do you think that's a legitimate question to be asking?
Sure. So I think before we get into the cost factor, we need to also see why is it, we are in IMF program as well, so we can't really be playing around too much. So what does the IMF say on electricity tariffs? Because what you would notice is that, like you said in the beginning, from 2014 to 2022, not a lot of changes on electricity tariffs, but we got our program in March 2023 and electricity tariffs started revising upwards. And that's because the IMF has also asked for cost recovery electricity pricing. And that doesn't mean that the CEB needs to be making profits. That is a misconception there. IMF has definitely not asked CEB to make 61 billion profits in 2023. It is also because the way IMF words it is that the CEB should not be making any profits after government transfers. Okay. So in other words, the CEB can be making losses, but if the government essentially collects enough revenue, it can set off the losses made. So the increase in tariff is essentially a compensating mechanism for government's poor revenue collection. Because if there were better revenue collection mechanisms, you could have set it off. So that's, I just wanted to clear the thing, is that it's not the IMF program mandating tariff increases.
Sure.
The IMF program is basically asking you to make sure that you don't make unnecessary losses in CEB. The next thing is looking, like you said, the cost. Where does the cost come in? And I think the news even reported recently that CEB made a 61 billion profit. And that is, in accounting terms, the net profit after all of your expenses. But there is also the concept of gross profits. That is your revenue minus the direct cost of producing electricity. When you look at gross profits, CEB has made a huge gross profit of 120 billion. But the net profit is only 60 billion, which means there's another 60 billion that is the interest cost or finance cost, which means that CEB has an unusually high amount of debt. And this is a recurring problem in many key SOEs like Sri Lankan Airlines, CPC, CEB. Most of them have high values of debt, and because they have high debt and some even in foreign currency, they have to pay a higher interest cost. And when they have to pay a higher interest cost, that also reduces profitability. So if you take off these SOE debts and you understand the SOE debt, so Sri Lanka is restructuring national debt, if we start looking at state-owned enterprise debt and start restructuring them, you create more space for CEB to make profits, and essentially that means that you can reduce tariffs a lot more. So to answer your question on high cost, the high cost not only comes from higher generation cost, but there's also a significant interest cost. For example, in 2022, interest cost for CEB was only 40 billion. Now in 2023, it has increased by 50% to 60 billion. So there's a lot of debt that we are paying interest on. And that alone needs to also be looked at before understanding where the cost comes from. So interest cost and generation cost are critical in looking at it, but it's also important to look at CEB debt. Because now what's happening is that because of poor decisions made by CEB or the state to take this debt, people have to pay a higher price because they have to compensate for those interest payments as well. But restructuring this debt is addressing the problem straight away. This has also been a recurring problem with fuel, where people were paying high prices for fuel because there was a higher cost on higher interest costs. So we need to really look at the state-owned enterprise debt and address them as well.
So Raj, we have a regulator for electricity. There are the key regulatory frameworks, the legal statutory frameworks, the ministry in charge, all of these stakeholders in place. However, if poor policy decisions are leading to an entire country having to struggle and suffer in the midst of this economic crisis, then what's the next step?
So I think the government has also identified the problem of CEB, and that's why we also have a restructuring plan. So restructuring CEB is quite critical, where you start looking at these debts and start understanding how can these debts be repaid. Maybe some of it needs to be taken back to the state books, because a few years ago, in order to make the central government debt look good, a few debt was transferred to state-owned enterprises. So it might be just taking those debt back into the state books. And it's also important to induce competition. The problem with CEB is that there's also a lack of transparency on procurement contracts and all of it. Because the fact that there is high tariffs even after this reduction indicates that there is higher cost, and unusually higher cost when compared to South Asia. And this higher cost means that the sector the energy sector is being run very ineffectively.
Okay.
And when you look at inefficiencies, one way is to decouple inefficiencies and remove CEB from, because CEB is now entirely in charge of dispatch, generation, transmission and all of it. So you can decouple them and encourage competition into transmission. Maybe generation is just CEB and transmission and all of it is other. You can encourage competition, which creates more transparency. The second thing is on procurement, where like the procurement of fuel, coal is not too transparent and could be played upon or have vested interest involved in. So creating more transparency in CEB's procurement and its dispatch is critical to ensure that there is more accountability. So to hold executives accountable, you need to have transparency on where the money is going. And the last thing is technology. So in terms of CEB, most of the equipment are quite old and they need to be revamped. That's of course a long term, and the efforts of it can only be reaped in the long term. But that's also important to update CEB's technology so that we are on the cutting edge in electricity generation, which will also help reduce cost.
All right, fantastic. We are in conversation with Rajakulendran. We're going for a break. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform. TV1. TV for life.
Gotabaya Rajapaksa to release book alleges international conspiracy worked to oust him from presidency. Take the current path or risk returning to a state of distress, questions President. Sri Lanka looks for debt moratorium till 2027. Why did Sri Lanka deploy a Navy ship to support US-led anti-Houthi operations? Navy commander provides explanation. Water cannons fired at IUSA protests in Colombo. 2 activists arrested. MP Ali Sabri Rahim suspended from Parliament for a month after gold smuggling saga.
TV1. TV for life. The People's Platform.
Welcome back. I'm in conversation with lead economist of Verite Research, Rajakulendran. Raj, when discussing the issues in the electricity power sector, we need to also talk about the inter-SOE debt. Does that need to be restructured? Because as at now, the CEB owes money to CPC.
Like you said, the debt composition of the Ceylon Electricity Board and most of SOEs are also interesting because yes, they have a bit of debt from foreign institutions. They might even have state debt that has been transferred to their books. But the interesting thing is on inter-SOE debt, where CEB buys fuel and coal or like other oil from CPC and they owe money to CPC, and and they're both run by the state. And when it comes to restructuring these SOEs, the inter-SOE debt plays a critical role in how these restructurings are moving forward. Unlike Sri Lankan Airlines, which we are privatizing at this point, and the government has announced to take 500 million USD on its state books. For CEB, of course, none of it has been announced yet, so we don't really know what the plan is and how it's being restructured. But addressing these interstate debts are critical because how we address the debt of CEB also affects the profitability and the functioning of CPC, because the CPC also has to get money from CEB, also from Sri Lankan Airlines as well. So and since one affects the other, restructuring of SOEs needs to also be looked at as in a holistic manner, as opposed to just one single SOE. And hopefully by June, July, you will see these restructurings being completed. So then we'll know better on how this debt is being treated.
It's a bit of a pickle, isn't it?
It is. It very much is.
Okay. How does all of this impact the IMF program and its progress?
Yes, so I think the question on how does CEB and the tariffs impact on the IMF program, the IMF program does not explicitly state anything on how the tariffs should be restructured, or how the tariffs should be structured rather. The IMF program, at least in its commitments based on the IMF tracker on Verity Research, it states that the CEB shouldn't be making any losses after government transfers, and as long as that is being met, the IMF program can continue. But anything unusual in terms of unusually high profits and or social unrest about this will definitely cause a bit of stir in the IMF program and needs to be looked at. But in terms of continuing on the IMF program, the bigger focus, at least for the IMF, is what is macro critical. And what is macro critical currently is on revenue collection and on debt restructuring. So the IMF is more focused on making sure that the government meets its quantitative targets and structural benchmarks. And if we look at areas where Sri Lanka is not progressing too well, that is areas on transparency requirements, or where the government is supposed to publish something. For example, publishing action plans for the anti-corruption law, or publishing tax holiday costings. How much do we lose out of tax holidays? So the government seems, in order for the IMF program, at least with the first review coming up in April, the government really needs to be focusing on improving transparency and publishing these requirements as mentioned in the IMF program, which also goes back to the point that I mentioned on CEB, where even with CEB the lack of transparency is a problem, because when you don't have transparency, it's harder for anybody to hold anyone accountable. Because when you don't disclose information, you can cook the books, you can play around with the numbers, and it's very hard to figure who is to be blamed. Especially with the whole point of CEB debt, do the people of Sri Lanka need to pay higher tariffs or forego higher reductions in tariffs just because there were poor policy decisions made in CEB taking on debt? See.
As at now, you mentioned that Sri Lanka's electricity tariffs are still quite high in comparison with the rest of South Asia. Speak to us about its overall impact, as in the grander scheme of things. People still have to pay higher electricity tariffs, and when electricity tariffs are high, this increases the cost of other goods and services.
So electricity, like fuel, has knock-on effects. Like you said, when electricity prices are quite high, other prices will also go up, and likewise when electricity prices reduce, other prices will also reduce. But like I said earlier, based on the analysis Verity did and looking at South Asian tariff structures, so this is without taxes, just looking at the electricity bills in South Asia, before this 21% reduction, anybody consuming above 60 kilowatts a month was paying the highest in South Asia. And to put things into context, 60 kilowatts a month is a criteria to identify whether you're poor or not. Right. So if you're technically below 60 kilowatts, you are eligible for it's a good indicator to identify the poverty, or like people who are eligible for social security. And Verity Research wrote this paper where we said that instead of having many criteria for identifying the poor, just using electricity consumption alone and using 60 kilowatts, you can target 80% of the poorest in Sri Lanka. So essentially, if you're not part of the poorest in Sri Lanka, you're paying the highest in South Asian electricity bills before the revision. But after this revision, what happens is that now if you're above 90 kilowatts, if you consume above 90 kilowatts a month, you still pay the South Asian average.
Right.
When you look at it in the grand scheme of things, there almost 50% of the population consume more than 60 kilowatts. So that is, initially that was quite unfair, but above 90 kilowatts, it's relatively less. So you can say now it's the burden on the vulnerable has greatly reduced.
Okay.
Because there's almost 30% reduction on the poor, on the low consuming ones.
Right.
But overall, it still remains high, and that is because, like I said earlier, it goes back to the problem of when you have high cost, you inevitably have to charge high tariffs.
Sure.
So at this point, it's about how do we reduce cost, and just because the IMF says cost reflective doesn't mean you pass the entire cost to the consumer.
Right.
It has to be reasonable cost. After removing all of the corruption and all of the vested interest, it's the actual cost that needs to be reflected. And now we are paying for inefficiencies in government revenue collection, inefficiencies in the way the CEB is run by having higher tariffs. And that essentially questions, is it fair for the people to pay for inefficiencies in the state sector and inefficiencies of the government and poor policy making without analysis, as opposed to purely cost reflective pricing?
Okay, in terms of solutions, Raj, you spoke of CEB being restructured. So how do we ensure that the restructuring takes place in a proper, reasonable, just manner? Speak to us about how we can also engage in advocacy work, how citizens can also engage themselves in the conversation.
So, in terms of restructuring or in terms of solutions to CEB long term, what needs to be done is, first of all, CEB's debt needs to be looked at, and that needs to be heavily looked at, because that also is the interest cost is almost equal to the profit made for 2023. Just shows the burden of interest cost. The second thing is, of course, we need to encourage competition into CEB. Maybe not all of electricity generation, but especially certain sections, maybe transmission, distribution, should have more competition in. The third thing is there needs to be more transparency on the procurement side of things, because that's where the high cost is. Because one trend you notice with electricity generation is that CEB has lower cost when we rely more on hydro.
Okay.
So when you have more hydro contributing to the generation mix, then you have lower cost. So we need to focus on renewable energy. We really need to focus on how we produce electricity. And when we rely too much on oil and coal, we have a higher cost, because obviously giving you electricity with petrol is a lot expensive than giving you electricity with water, that's hydro. So facilitating that is quite important, and looking at generation mix, and making it more transparent on the procurement side of things. How much are we paying for the fuel and the coal and all of it? And lastly, that is the technology side of things, because that takes a long time to address and needs to be addressed now for us to bear fruits in the future. Where CEB's technology is quite outdated, we constantly hear Norachole is being, it just stopped working, we need to go and fix it. So technology needs to be updated, and when you have the cutting edge technology, you have reduced cost. So those are the four things that needs to be looked at in terms of lowering costs, so that tariffs can be lower as well.
Right. And how do we hold to account the stakeholders in this process? So
this is where the regulator like the PUCSL comes into play. There's actually text in the IMF program where we want to get rid of the PUCSL regulator and have the minister in charge, or the CEB in charge of electricity tariffs. However, what needs to be looked at is that you need to have regulatory bodies so that they hold each other accountable.
Sure.
And the PUCSL does do public consultation where anyone can write to PUCSL on recommendations to sell on electricity board. So this analysis was also submitted to PUCSL, so the public and other stakeholders should also actively engage in these stakeholder meetings, send recommendations in, and also provide analysis to show electricity tariffs should be reduced. For example, even the analysis that weighted it is fairly straightforward, because it's a matter of just getting the electricity tariffs in other countries and just calculating electricity bill. And just showing that Sri Lanka is unfairly charging a lot more from its citizens than the rest of the South Asian peers. So actively getting involved in these consultations really holds executives accountable, and when they see people getting involved, they also have the incentive to be more accountable and transparent in policy actions.
Okay, fabulous. This was a very interesting conversation. Thank you, Rajakulendran, lead economist.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.